What I remember most about that morning isn't what my sister said. It's the way she looked past me when she said it, straight out at the lake, like she couldn't quite bring herself to meet my eyes. Before I tell you everything, do me a favor. Hit like and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious how far these stories travel. This started, the way most complicated things do, much earlier than it seemed. I'm a registered nurse. I've been working in the same hospital in Ottawa for 11 years now, and for the first 8 of those years I said yes to almost every extra shift I was offered. Evenings, weekends, holiday doubles, call-ins when someone was sick and the unit was short. I was not doing it purely for the overtime, although the overtime helped. I was doing it because I had something I was working toward, and the only way to get there was to work. My grandmother had owned a cottage property on a lake about 2 hours east of the city for as long as I could remember. I spent every summer of my childhood there, learning to paddle a canoe, picking wild blueberries on the trail north of the property, sitting on the dock in the evenings, when the water went flat and still, and the light came in low across the surface. It was the place in the world where I felt most like myself. When she got older and managing the property on her own became difficult, I started showing up more often. I drove up on weekends to help with things that needed doing. When the septic system had to be replaced, I dealt with the contractors. When the basement flooded one spring, I called the insurance company and stayed on top of the claim until it was settled. In the last 3 years of her life, when she could no longer drive herself, I took her to all of her medical appointments. Sometimes twice in a single week, depending on what was happening with her health. My sister lived 40 minutes away from our grandmother during that time. She visited on birthdays and at Christmas. I am not saying this to be harsh. I am saying it because it matters to what comes later. When our grandmother passed away 4 years ago, her will was precise. The cottage property, the land, the building, the dock, all of it, was to be transferred to me, not shared among the family, not divided, to me by name alone. My parents were surprised. My sister was quiet in the lawyer's office in a way that I understand differently now than I did then. At the time I assumed she was grieving. I think she was already doing a different kind of calculation. I spent the following year putting $38,000 of my own money into that property. Savings from years of night shifts and a lifestyle I kept deliberately modest. I replaced the roof, which had been leaking along the north edge for 2 winters. I had the dock rebuilt because 2 of the main support posts had rotted through at the waterline. I upgraded the electrical panel, which was decades out of code, and added proper insulation to the walls on the lake-facing side. I took out property insurance and title insurance in my own name. I filed and paid the property taxes every year on schedule. The property was appraised the following autumn at just over $315,000. My name was the only one on the deed. There was no family arrangement, no shared agreement, no promise made to anyone else about access or future ownership. Legally, financially, practically, it was mine. I believed that was the end of the conversation. I was wrong. The call came on a Tuesday evening in late March. I had just finished a 12-hour shift that had stretched into 13, and I was sitting in the hospital parking lot not quite ready to drive home yet. The number on my screen was a Toronto area code I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. The man on the other end was calm and measured. He introduced himself as a representative of a private lending company and said he was reaching out regarding a debt of $68,000 that had been secured against a property registered in my name. A cottage property. I told him there had to be a mistake. I told him I had never borrowed money from any private lender, and that no one had my permission to use my property as collateral for anything. He said he understood that was my position. He said his firm held signed documentation. I asked what documentation. He said he wasn't in a position to discuss the details by phone, but that I had 28 days to respond formally before his company would begin proceedings against the property. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after he hung up. The sky had gone dark. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead in that particular way they do in March, when the cold is still in everything. I kept going back to a conversation I'd had about 5 weeks earlier, when my sister had called me out of nowhere to ask whether I would consider helping her with some financial trouble she was dealing with. I asked her to be specific. She got vague. I told her I didn't have $60-odd thousand sitting around, and she said it was fine, she'd work it out herself. That was the last time we'd spoken. I called her that night. I called again, voicemail. I sent a text asking her to call me back immediately because I had just received a call about a debt connected to my property, and I needed to know what was happening. Nothing came back that night. I called my mother, who picked up on the second ring and said, before I had gotten very far, I was hoping you'd call. Can you come to the house this weekend? The way she said it, not surprised, not alarmed, just waiting, told me something. I wasn't calling with news. I was calling into something that was already in motion. I didn't sleep much. By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for a family meeting where everyone spoke carefully around the edges of the truth. I needed to see exactly what was on file. I drove to the land registry office when it opened. In Ontario, the title history of any property is a matter of public record, and I had every right to pull the documents on something registered in my name. The clerk searched the file, printed what was there, and I sat at one of the tables by the window. The first pages were exactly what I expected. The estate transfer from my grandmother's estate to me was there. The title insurance policy was there. The utility easements along the north edge of the lot were there. Everything I had signed myself, in the order I remembered it. Then I turned to a document near the back and stopped. It was a mortgage agreement. According to that document, I had borrowed $68,000 from a numbered company I had never heard of, secured against the cottage, 8 weeks prior. The agreement had my name on it. It had a signature. I looked at that signature for a long time. I know how I sign my name. I've put it on nursing documentation, on legal transfer papers, on every tax return I've filed for the past 15 years. There are specific habits in the way I form letters, the angle of the first character, the way the pen moves through the middle section, the direction it lifts at the very end. The signature on that mortgage document was an attempt at mine. It wasn't careless. Whoever had written it had clearly practiced. But the proportions were wrong. The pen pressure was different. The final stroke turned right when mine always turns left. I photographed every page before I left. On the drive home, I kept circling the same question. How had this been done? Forging a mortgage document in Ontario requires more than a copied signature. It requires identification. It requires a commissioner of oaths or notary to certify that the person signing appeared before them in person. Someone had produced documentation to make this look legitimate. My sister couldn't have done that with nothing. She would have needed access to my personal papers, forms with my signature, documents with my identifying information. And then I thought about the boxes. About 2 years ago, when I had been doing a clean out at my own place, and my parents had offered to store some folders at their house temporarily, I had left a plastic bin in their basement. Old professional records, a couple of years of tax returns, copies of forms I had submitted for nursing license renewals, some personal correspondence. I had meant to pick it up. I kept forgetting. My parents kept saying it was in a safe spot. I drove to their house without calling ahead. My mother answered the door and let me in when I said I needed to get into the basement to find some old files. I went downstairs alone. I found my bin on a shelf in the storage room. When I opened it, something was immediately wrong. I know how I organize my own papers. Documents were out of sequence. A folder that should have contained 2 forms had only one. A summary page from a tax return was present, but the T4 slip that always accompanied it was missing. I looked at the shelf around it. There was a small cardboard box I didn't recognize sitting just above, no label. I opened it. Inside was a Commissioner of Oaths stamp, still in its original plastic packaging. Beside it was a receipt from an online office supply company, printed out and folded once. The date on the receipt was 6 weeks earlier. The name on the billing address was not mine, not my parents', but a business name I recognized immediately. It was the name of my sister's company. The online boutique she had been running for 3 years. The one she had mentioned was going through some challenges the last time we had talked about it. I sat on the bottom stair and just breathed for a moment. This wasn't a panicked mistake made in a single desperate afternoon. Someone had identified which documents they needed, accessed them, produced a fraudulent mortgage, forged a signature, purchased a Commissioner of Oaths stamp to make it appear that the signing had been properly witnessed, filed it against my property. That is something you plan. That is something you work toward over weeks. I photographed everything before I left, the receipt, the stamp in its packaging, the bin with my files, the gaps where things had been removed. Then I went upstairs. My mother was standing in the kitchen. I asked her one question. Did she know what my sister had done? She looked down at the counter and said, Your sister was in a very difficult position. I asked if that meant yes. She said, we were all hoping this could be resolved without it turning into something that didn't need to be. I left. That evening I drove to the cottage. I needed to be there. I took my dog, a 12-year-old black lab who has been making this drive with me since she was a puppy, and we sat on the dock until well after dark. The lake was quiet. My grandmother's wild bergamot was starting to show its first growth along the stone wall by the path. The canoe we had paddled together every summer for years was pulled up on shore exactly where I always leave it. At around 9:15, headlights appeared at the end of the lane. A car I didn't recognize pulled up near the gate. 2 people got out and walked toward the property line. My dog stood up immediately, low and alert in a way I had never seen from her before. I walked down to the gate. The man who spoke introduced himself as being there on behalf of the lending company to conduct a preliminary site assessment of the secured asset. I said this was private property and that no assessment had been authorized by anyone with authority to authorize it. He looked past me at the cottage, then at the canoe on shore. I raised my phone. I told him I was recording the conversation, that he and his companion were standing on private property without permission, and that if they did not leave immediately, I would call the OPP. They turned and went back to the car, but before he got in, the man stopped and looked over at me. You should talk to your sister soon, he said. She's indicated that the personal contents of the property could be subject to assessment if this isn't resolved. I didn't answer. They drove away. I stood at the gate for a long time, the personal contents, the furniture inside, my grandmother's dishes, still in the cupboard above the sink where she had always kept them, the canoe, the garden that came back every spring without anyone tending it, because she had chosen plants that knew how to take care of themselves. The idea that any of it could be touched because of something my sister had signed with a name that wasn't hers. I don't have clean words for that feeling. What I know is that something went very still in me standing at that gate. Still in the way that means a decision has already been made. My sister arrived the next morning before 8 o'clock. She hadn't come alone. My mother was with her, my aunt, a cousin I hadn't spent significant time with in several years, who apparently had opinions about how this situation should be handled. I was outside when they pulled in. Nobody had called ahead. My sister didn't wait. She walked straight across the gravel and said she needed me to understand the reality of the position she was in. She said $68,000 was not an amount that should be allowed to damage the family. She said that I had received this property without having paid for it, that our grandmother had played favorites, that the fairest thing I could do now was to help absorb a situation that had gotten out of hand. I want to be precise, because I don't want to misrepresent what she actually said. She said, "You didn't buy this place, you didn't earn it. You just happened to be the one who made yourself useful at the right time." My mother stepped forward and said that what mattered now was protecting the family from something that could not be undone. She asked me to think about what going to the authorities would mean. Not just for my sister, but for my sister's children. My aunt nodded. My cousin folded her arms and looked at me like she was waiting for me to come to my senses. I thought about 11 years of nursing shifts. I thought about the roof and the dock and the electrical panel, and $38,000 I had put into a property I chose to protect because I believed it was worth protecting. I thought about a Commissioner of Oaths stamp purchased under my sister's business name, sitting in my parents' basement. I thought about a signature on a mortgage document that was not mine. I took out my phone and called the Ontario Provincial Police non-emergency line. Nobody spoke while I was on the call. I told the dispatcher that I needed to report title fraud, that a fraudulent mortgage had been registered against my property, using a forged signature, and what appeared to be a fraudulent Commissioner of Oaths certification, and that I had documentary evidence. I gave my address and said I was available to make a full statement whenever officers could come. My sister walked to the far end of the driveway and stood with her back to me. My mother pressed her hand over her mouth. My aunt got into her car. When I ended the call, my mother looked at me and said very quietly, "You didn't have to do this." I looked at her. "Yes, I did," I said. "And I think somewhere you know that I did." 2 OPP officers arrived within the hour. They were professional and unhurried. I gave them copies of everything. The fraudulent mortgage from the land registry file, photographs from the storage room in my parents' basement, images of the Commissioner of Oaths stamp, and the receipt bearing my sister's company name, and the phone recording from the night before, when the lending company's representatives had come to the property. One officer reviewed each document carefully, while the other took my full written statement. When the officer looking at the mortgage document raised his head, he explained that what I had described, a forged signature, a fraudulent Commissioner of Oaths certification, the unauthorized registration of a lien, constituted title fraud and mortgage fraud under the Criminal Code of Canada. He confirmed those were serious federal offenses. He asked whether I wanted to make a formal complaint. I told him I did. My cousin had driven away before the officers arrived. My sister and my mother left shortly after I signed the statement. My aunt went without saying anything to me. The investigation moved quickly once the documents were in official hands. Within 6 weeks, the fraudulent lien was formally discharged from my title after OPP investigators, and the land registry confirmed that the mortgage had been executed using a forged signature and an invalid Commissioner of Oaths stamp. The numbered company behind the lien was flagged in connection with irregular mortgage filings across Ontario and Quebec, and a broader investigation was opened that involved people beyond my family. My sister was charged with fraud over $5,000, forgery, and use of a forged document, all criminal code offenses. She is working through the legal process now. I'm not going to pretend I feel nothing about that. She is still my sister. But she used my name, my property, and the trust I had never thought to question, and she did it deliberately, and she involved others in keeping it quiet. What I feel about all of it is layered and it changes depending on the day. What doesn't change is the knowledge that I did the right thing. My father called about a month after the charges were laid. He said he hadn't known precisely what had been filed until it was already done, and that he should have asked more questions earlier and stopped things before they reached the point they reached. I believe that's true. I also believe it doesn't fully account for the silence around my mother's kitchen table during those weeks when they all knew something I didn't. We speak occasionally now. Things between us are different. I expect they always will be. My mother has not called. That is her choice. I've had time to sit with it. This past spring I drove up to open the cottage for the season, the same way I do every year, airing out the rooms, checking the pipes, dragging the dock furniture out of the shed. The hostas were pushing up through the pine needles along the front path. My grandmother's bergamot was coming back along the stone wall, spreading a little further than the year before, the way she always said it would. I put the canoe in the water on the first warm evening and paddled out to the middle of the lake. The title on that property has one name on it. It had my name on it the day my grandmother's estate transferred it to me. It has my name on it now. After everything, the forged documents, the people who came to my gate, my family standing in the driveway asking me to absorb someone else's dishonesty and call it loyalty, I understand something I don't think I fully understood before. Protecting what you earned, what you cared for, what someone who loved you chose to leave in your hands, that is not a failure of family. It is a statement about what you believe is true. I believe honesty is real. I believe what belongs to you belongs to you. And I believe that the people who ask you to stay quiet to protect them from the consequences of their own actions are not asking out of love. They are asking out of fear. I'm not afraid of that anymore. If any part of this felt familiar to you, if you've ever been asked to choose between protecting your family and protecting the truth, I'd really like to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and if this story meant something to you, please subscribe. There are more stories here, and some of them might feel very close to home.